Japan officially signed the Surrender Act on September 2, 1945, aboard the American battleship USS Missouri. For the world, it marked the end of one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. But for the Japanese generals, it was only the beginning of their personal war, a war for survival, a war to clear their names, a war to be forgotten. Those who had commanded millions of soldiers just the day before suddenly became the target of investigation, accusations, and revenge. The American press called them Japanese Nazis. The international community demanded justice for Nanking, for Manila, for the mass executions, and for the atrocious crimes committed against prisoners and civilians. But has justice arrived? Unlike the Nuremberg trials in Europe, Asia was a completely different place. The United States had a plan, not only to punish the criminals, but also to rebuild Japan as an ally against communism. And this is where the story begins to take a dark turn. Because not all generals were tried, not all were hanged, some were saved. But who decided who would die and who would live? How many names were deliberately erased from the list of accused? And were some really allowed to leave quietly, in exchange for something far more valuable than their lives? At the top of the Japanese war machine were men whose names still inspire fear: Hideki Tojo, Tomoyuki Yamashita, Masaharu Homma, Kenji Doihara. Imperial army generals who not only planned conquests, but also authorized mass executions, sexual slavery, and human experimentation. Hideki Tojo, former Prime Minister of Japan, was the mastermind behind many military and political decisions. He approved the attack on Pearl Harbor, but he didn't act alone. Operating in his shadow was a whole group of generals who commanded the fronts in China, Korea, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. Their actions were brutal, ruthless, and, as later proven, planned with full awareness of the consequences. Tomoyuki Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya, is famous for his swift conquest of Singapore. But his name is also associated with the Manila Massacre, where Japanese forces massacred tens of thousands of civilians. Masaharu Homma, commander of the forces in the Philippines, was responsible for the Bataan Death March, in which thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died of exhaustion, starvation, and torture. Kenji Doihara, the quiet architect of Japanese expansion into Manchuria, is considered by many to be Asia's most astute and influential war strategist. These men weren't mere generals. They were symbols of imperial power, faithful followers of the emperor, treated like a living god. For them, war was a sacred duty, and defeat, a humiliation they had to overcome somehow, or bleed to death. But what happened to them after the war? Who died? Who survived? Who disappeared? Following Japan's surrender, the world demanded justice. The Nuremberg trials began in Europe, where Nazi leaders were tried before an international tribunal. Asia would have its equivalent, and thus the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, also known as the Tokyo Trials, was born. 28 senior military officers, politicians, and imperial advisors were charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The trial lasted more than 2 years, from 1946 to 1948, and was one of the most controversial events of the post-war period. But this process was not as transparent as it might seem. The tribunal was composed primarily of judges from allied countries, including the United States, Great Britain, the USSR, China, Australia, Canada, and India. From the outset, there were voices claiming that the trial was more political than fair. Many decisions were made behind closed doors, and the most important issue was completely ignored. Emperor Hirohito, supreme commander of the armed forces and national deity, was completely excluded from the charges at the behest of the United States. The Americans believed that keeping the emperor on the throne would facilitate the occupation and stabilization of the country. It was a costly political compromise. During the trial, no documents that could directly incriminate Hirohito were allowed to be published. As a result, all the defendants, including Hideki Tojo, were forced to take the blame, protecting the emperor like a shield. Although many generals were sentenced to death by hanging and others to life imprisonment, questions remain. Why didn't they judge them all? Why were some never brought to justice? And why were some allowed to leave quietly? Hideki Tojo was the face of wartime Japan. As Prime Minister and Minister of War, he became a symbol of the ruthless military empire that had swept across Asia. He oversaw the attack on Pearl Harbor, the declaration of war on the United States, and the expansion of imperialist forces into China, Korea, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. After Japan's surrender, Tojo disappeared from public life. He knew he was the Allies' primary target. On September 11, 1945, just before being arrested by the American military police, he attempted suicide. He shot himself in the chest. He was unsuccessful. He survived, and the Americans made sure he didn't die. He had to answer in court. During the trial, Tojo accepted full responsibility for Japan's actions. He made no attempt to defend himself, denied them, or blame others. On the contrary, he attempted to protect Emperor Hirohito, claiming he had acted on his own initiative. For many, this was an act of loyalty. For others, it was part of an agreement to protect Japan from further humiliation. In December 1948, Tojo was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. He was executed on December 23, 1948, at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. But Tojo's story did not end with his death. Years later, in far-right and Japanese nationalist circles, he began to be portrayed not as a criminal, but as a patriot who sacrificed himself for the sake of the emperor. At the Yasukuni Shrine, his name is listed among those of other war martyrs. Was he a monster, a loyal servant of the empire, or maybe a scapegoat who took all the blame so others could disappear without a trace? Tomoyuki Yamashita was one of the most talented strategists in the Japanese army. He earned the nickname Tiger of Malaya after his lightning conquest of British Singapore in 1942, one of the greatest defeats of the British Empire. In Japan, he became a symbol of victory, a master of strategy, a commander capable of humiliating a Western colonial power. But his legend ended bloodily, not on the battlefield, but in the courtroom. After the war, Yamashita was captured by American forces and charged with war crimes committed by his troops during the fighting in the Philippines, particularly during the Manila Massacre, where more than 100,000 civilians, women, children, and the elderly, were killed, shot, burned alive, raped, and bayoneted. The problem is that Yamashita didn't give those orders. His defense was based on the fact that, at the time of the massacre, he had no real control over the actions of his units, which operated chaotically, isolated from command. But the U.S. military tribunal wasn't interested in nuances. What was needed was an example, a punishment, a signal to the world. Yamashita was sentenced to death, not for what he personally did, but for what he failed to stop. The verdict sparked an international controversy. Numerous lawyers and historians claimed it was a sham trial, lacking a fair investigation and unfair competition. Nevertheless, on February 23, 1946, the general was hanged at Muntinlupa prison in the Philippines. His name became a symbol of a still controversial doctrine in the law of war, so-called command responsibility. This means that a military commander can be convicted of crimes even if he did not order them, if only he should have known. But did Yamashita really should have known? Or was he sacrificed on the altar of American revenge? Masaharu Homma wasn't your typical Japanese general. He had studied at Oxford, admired Western culture, wrote poetry, and was known for being more forgiving than his brutal comrades. But history had a different story in store for him, one in which he would go down in history as responsible for one of the most brutal tragedies of the Pacific War, the Bataan Death March. In April 1942, following the surrender of American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula, some 75,000 prisoners of war were forced to walk some 100 kilometers under a scorching sun without food, water, or medical care. Those who became weak were beaten, stabbed with bayonets, shot, or buried alive. At least 10,000 people died. Although Homer did not directly supervise the march, as Commander-in-Chief of the Philippine campaign, he was held responsible for crimes committed by his subordinates. After the war in 1946, he appeared before a U.S. military tribunal in Manila. His trial lasted only 3 weeks. Homer claimed he was unaware of the extent of the atrocities and that the orders regarding the treatment of prisoners had not come from him. Despite this, the tribunal did not believe him. He was sentenced to death and shot on April 3, 1946. Many military historians believe Homer was a victim of political pressure. The Americans, having suffered a humiliating defeat at Bataan, needed revenge. And Homer, although not the direct executioner, was the perfect symbol to attribute the blame. His death, however, did not end the reckoning. On the contrary, it became the beginning of the question: was post-war justice fair or just convenient? While generals like Tojo, Yamashita, and Homer were tried and executed, many others simply disappeared from history. Not because of their innocence, but because in the new balance of power after the war, their knowledge was more valuable than their death. Some were included in the so-called silent amnesty, an informal agreement between U.S. authorities and the Japanese military elite. The United States, increasingly concerned about the spread of communism in Asia, decided to ignore the past of many officers in exchange for their loyalty, seeking to build a new anti-communist ally. One such example was General Nobusuke Kishi, a former member of the wartime government who collaborated with the occupation forces in Manchuria during the war. After the war, he was arrested as a Class A war criminal, but never brought to trial. Instead, he became Prime Minister of Japan from 1957 to 1960. Yes, a war criminal became a politician in a democratic state under U.S. patronage. Many high-ranking generals and officers were also recycled into the newly formed Japanese self-defense forces, which, although officially peaceful, had a structure almost identical to that of the Imperial Army. Their military knowledge and experience were too valuable to waste. Others have disappeared forever. There are reports of former generals emigrating to South America, hiding under false names, often with the help of a support network, similar to that which aided many Nazis. Others were hired as military advisors, academics, or consultants, and were never held accountable for their crimes. This silence, these gaps in the archives, these missing names, are no coincidence. They are the result of the conscious decision that it is better to build the future on comfortable oblivion than on the full truth. In the shadow of the official trials and executions, a story that had been kept secret for decades was unfolding. A deal that would forever change the face of post-war justice. War crimes exchanged for scientific data. One of the most shocking examples was the fate of Unit 731, a secret research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army responsible for biological and chemical experiments on humans. Under the leadership of General Shiro Ishii, the scientists in this unit performed horrific tests on human subjects, prisoners of war, women and children, including freezing limbs to the point of bursting, injecting them with plague and anthrax viruses, performing vivisections without anesthesia, limb amputations, and even experiments with biological bombs. At the end of the war, it was expected that the members of Unit 731 would be tried for crimes against humanity, just as the Nazis responsible for the concentration camps had been. But that never happened. The U.S. military intelligence services, especially the CIA and military intelligence services, understood that the data obtained by the Japanese could be invaluable in the coming Cold War, especially in the context of the fight against the USSR and the development of biological weapons. In exchange for full documentation of the research, details of the experiments, and personal consultations with the scientists, the United States granted immunity to the members of Unit 731. Neither General Shiro Ishii nor his team were ever prosecuted. Many of them later went on to work in medicine, the pharmaceutical industry, and even academia. What could have been one of Asia's most important war agreements was swept under the rug in the name of geopolitical interests. Victims, they were never recognized. Perpetrators, saved, rewarded, forgotten, and the data from hell became the property of the new superpower. The official narrative after World War II was that the Allies were restoring justice, solving crimes, and building a peaceful new world order. But behind the scenes, the United States was playing a very different game, one in which the goal was not punishment, but influence. As soon as the situation calmed down after Japan's surrender, Washington realized that the new enemy was no longer Tokyo, but Moscow. The Cold War had begun, and Japan, previously the #1 enemy, suddenly became a strategic ally. In this new reality, the United States did everything possible to secure Japan's loyalty, even if it meant protecting war criminals and erasing the traces of the past. The most striking example was the decision to completely exonerate Emperor Hirohito from criminal liability. Although evidence indicated that he, as commander-in-chief of the army, knew about the crimes, he was spared. The Americans knew that Hirohito was a national symbol and a godlike figure for the Japanese. His fall could lead to chaos and resistance to the occupation. So General Douglas MacArthur, commander-in-chief of the occupation forces, decided the emperor would stay. The condition? Silence. Hirohito had to disassociate himself from all responsibility, and his loyalty to the new authorities had to be unquestionable. And so it was. But that's not the end. Many other high-ranking officers and officials were also placed under protection if they agreed to cooperate, by providing information, supporting the creation of a new administration, or helping to suppress communism. CIA and U.S. military intelligence files contained documents showing how the United States deliberately excluded names from criminal lists, manipulated testimony, and made deals with former enemies. The official version of the story is, justice has been done. The unofficial, more brutal version is, only those who had outlived their usefulness were punished. One of the most disturbing aspects of post-war Japan is not only the crimes committed, but also the way they were erased from the collective memory. While Germany underwent a profound process of historical reflection and learning after the war, Japan chose silence. In the 1950s and 1960s, under pressure from the United States and the emerging Japanese right, a process of historical editing began. School textbooks began to omit or minimize events such as the Nanjing Massacre, Unit 731, and the Bataan Death March. Instead of discussing crimes, they taught about the difficult times of war and the courageous resistance to Western colonialism. The generals responsible for mass executions were no longer called criminals. Some were even presented as defenders of the nation. For decades, students grew up in an educational system that either ignored or completely ignored the dark chapters of the war. War museums in Japan, including the famous Yushukan Museum at Tokyo's Yasukuni Shrine, present the war from the Japanese perspective of a victim. Exhibits cover the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but make no mention of Nanking, Korean women forced into sexual slavery, or biological experiments on humans. Because silence was convenient. Because too many influential people had something to hide. Because the memory of the crimes hindered the rebuilding of national pride. because the truth was too uncomfortable and too politically costly. Meanwhile, the victims' families waited, and continue to wait, for the words, "I'm sorry," which in many cases they never heard. While some Japanese generals appeared before the tribunal, sentenced to death or life imprisonment, others, equally responsible for the atrocities of the war, began a new life, without trial, without sentencing, without accountability. Many of them continued to live in Japan under their own names, often protected by former associates or the new state apparatus. Others changed their identities and took refuge in rural areas where their past was considered taboo. Some became military advisors in the creation of the Japanese self-defense forces, paradoxically, the new army of a country that was supposedly pacifist after the war. Their knowledge of the battlefield was invaluable. Their involvement in crimes was silenced. Others began academic careers. They became professors of military history, strategy, and logistics. At universities, no one asked questions about the past because the answers could be too uncomfortable. There was no shortage of those who entered politics. Several former imperial military officers entered parliament, while others served as government advisors. The example of Nobusuke Kishi, former Minister of War and alleged Class A criminal who became Prime Minister of Japan, shows how thin the line between shame and power was. Some generals wrote books justifying their war decisions, downplaying casualties, or denying historical facts. These books sold well, especially among nationalist youth. There was, and still is, a discreet acceptance of these figures in Japanese society. Some were treated as victims of American propaganda, others as innocent obedience, and still others simply as people doing what they had to do to survive. But where does survival end and money laundering begin? And how many of those who should have been sitting in the dock died peacefully in their beds, surrounded by their families and respect? In the heart of Tokyo, surrounded by the silence of trees and traditional architecture, stands Yasukuni Shrine, Japan's national monument. At first glance, it is a peaceful place of prayer, but for millions of people in East Asia, it is a symbol of pain, forgetfulness, and provocation. The shrine was founded in 1869 to honor those who died in the service of the emperor. But what makes Yasukuni particularly controversial is that among the more than 2.4 million names commemorated are those of first-class war criminals, including generals like Hideki Tojo. In 1978, the names of 14 prominent war criminals were secretly added to the temple's registry of holy spirits. Since then, every visit by politicians, especially Japanese prime ministers, has sparked an international scandal. China, South Korea, the Philippines, and other Asian countries consider these visits an insult to the memory of the victims, a glorification of criminals, and a lack of remorse on the part of Japan. For them, Yasukuni is not a place of mourning, but a symbol of the denial of history. On the other hand, Japanese nationalists and conservatives defend the shrine as a spiritual heritage site and say that war victims deserve to be honored regardless of how their past was viewed. The Japanese government has oscillated between domestic pressure and international anger for years. Prime ministers visit the shrine privately as citizens or send symbolic offerings with a declaration of peace. But that's never enough to heal the wounds. Yasukuni Shrine not only commemorates the dead, but also reminds us that war doesn't end with the last shot. Sometimes it lingers silently within the shrine walls, hidden amid incense and prayers. Behind every general's decision, behind every order, behind every war strategy, were the faces of those who suffered and died in silence. Women, children, the elderly, prisoners in concentration camps, civilians in the streets of bombed cities, soldiers who surrendered hoping for humane treatment. Too often their stories have been forgotten or deliberately silenced. In the Philippines, China, Korea, and much of Asia, Hundreds of thousands of victims of Japanese war crimes never received justice. The Tokyo trials brought a handful of commanders to justice, but most of the perpetrators went unpunished. And those who survived still bear the scars, not only physical, but also psychological and social. One of the most poignant examples is the so-called comfort women, girls and women who were kidnapped or forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese army. Most came from Korea, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Held in so-called comfort houses, they were raped daily by dozens of soldiers and treated as weapons of war. After the war, many of them were unable to return home due to shame and trauma. For decades, their suffering was ignored, and the Japanese government acknowledged no responsibility. The situation was similar for the thousands of civilians murdered in the massacres of Nanjing, Manila, and Singapore. Their names will not appear in textbooks, their voices will not be heard in museums. For the victims' families, time has stood still. They continue to demand acknowledgement of guilt, an official apology, and compensation, but are met with a wall of indifference. In Japan, the issue remains a contentious political topic that many are afraid to touch, because the truth about the suffering of these people destroys the image of a modern and proud state. Or perhaps that's why it must finally be told. Among the names of Japanese generals forever etched in the history of warfare, one is disappearing from textbooks, the media, and even national memory. Kenji Doihara, known as the Japanese Eichmann, responsible for the insidious invasion plans of Manchuria, drug trafficking, and mass ethnic cleansing. He was not only a military man, but also a master of intelligence and manipulation. He orchestrated provocations to justify Japanese aggression. He created puppet governments, crushed resistance, and imposed a settlement policy in which thousands of Chinese lost their lives or were forced into forced labor. Despite his role in one of Japan's most cynical expansionist plans, the public never saw him as a symbol of evil. Why? Because he operated silently in the shadows, like the shadow of the empire he served. At the Tokyo trials, he was declared a Class A war criminal. He was sentenced to death, but without much media attention or recognition. He was hanged in December 1948, along with Tojo and other generals. And although his crimes could fill volumes, his name has disappeared from public discussion. In Japan, he is barely mentioned. In Asia, only those who survived his brutal policies remember him. For posterity, he remains a shadow that died in silence, without monuments, without condemnation, without memory. Or maybe that's what he meant. Is it possible that the greatest success of some war criminals is not having avoided trial, but having avoided being remembered? When we look at post-war Japan, modern, advanced, and democratic, it's easy to fall into the error of thinking that the crimes of World War II are just a distant shadow of the past. But that shadow still moves. And although the generals' names have been erased from textbooks, their legacy hasn't disappeared. It's simply changed shape. This legacy is hidden in silence, in what is left unsaid, in museums that omit the facts, in politicians who visit the Yasukuni Shrine despite worldwide protests, in textbooks that teach patriotism but not responsibility. It is also a legacy present in the unfinished stories of the victims who are still fighting for the truth to be acknowledged. Their voices are quiet, but not silent. Every week, elderly women, former comfort women, protest in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, holding signs that read, "Remember us." This legacy is felt in the debates about whether Japan has truly come to terms with its past. Will the prosecution of a handful of generals be enough to close the chapter of atrocities? Can a peaceful nation be built on the foundation of silence? Today, the descendants of these generals live in a new world. Many of them, like Nobusuke Kishi's grandson Shinzo Abe, have reached the highest levels of power. And while they are not guilty of the crimes of their grandfathers, they carry a history that the country does not want to fully reveal. Because perhaps the greatest victory of those who died in silence is that they have been forgotten. Or perhaps the greatest responsibility of the generations that came after them is to refuse to forget this.